So we were talking about Alberti and discussing Santa Maria Novella, the facade of an older church, and in fact, you can see at the bottom. I think I mentioned you can see some of the original Gothic arches that were left over. But essentially, the vast majority of the facade was designed in the Renaissance style by Alberti, and comparing that to San Miniato al Monte, which is sort of proto-Renaissance, which means prior to both in timeline, but also it has sort of classical elements, but is not an actual revival of Roman architecture. It has the arcade, it has some of the columns, it sort of looks like a temple front on top. But if you compare it to Alberti's Facada Santa Maria Novella, you can see it's much more specifically a temple here on the top, and the detailing and the sophistication and the accuracy of some of the classical details is much better. And then the big innovation were these scrolls that introduce really curvature into a building in a way that had not been done before. Certainly the Romans had not done this. And so it's this highlighting too the idea that the Renaissance architects, they started with this inspiration of sort of reviving Roman architecture, especially, but then then it evolves and it starts to strike out and become something unique on its own. And we're going to especially see next week when we talk about Baroque architecture that it really evolves into something completely different than anything the Romans would have been familiar with. Okay, so Alberti had a couple other buildings I just wanted to mention briefly. Sant'Andrea in Mantua. This is from 1456, finished in 1470. Mantua is up here in northern Italy. And this is important because the plan, this is a full design, unlike Santa Maria Novella, which is just a facade of an older Gothic church. Sant'Andrea is an actual complete design and construction by Alberti. And so this is really a revival of the old basilica, and especially the early Christian churches that adopted the Roman basilica form as their plan. And they did that, if you remember from the fall, I think I asked you on the exams, they did that because the basilica worked for them with the long hall, with the seat of power at the one end where the priest and altar would be in a church. And it wasn't a Roman temple, it wasn't associated with paganism, and so the Christians didn't feel conflicted about that. And so, the plans continued that way even with Gothic architecture and medieval architecture, but they really began to evolve. Alberti goes back to a really much more distinct plan and design of a true Roman basilica here. There still has the long nave with the altar and apse at the one end, and then a pretty distinct transept and crossing that we actually began to see more in Gothic architecture. But the interior especially, and you can start to see it a little bit in the section here. First of all, he puts a dome at the crossing. Okay, that's something that we didn't see in Gothic architecture. And so this is pretty critical, and really makes this distinctive as a Renaissance era church because of the dome. But really, when we'll look at the outside first, but when we see the interior, I think we can even see closer the association with Roman architecture. The exterior is very classical, right? This is not Gothic at all. We got a rounded Roman arch that's really deep enough to be more of a vault at this point. It's flanked by classical pilasters both at the entrance, but then these massive pilasters here on the sides that flank smaller rounded Roman arched windows and niches as well. And then we have really a temple front. At the top of these massive pilasters is an entablature and then a triangular pediment on top. So the proportions are overall don't really look like a Roman temple, and this is part of that evolution of where they're starting with the base of Roman architecture, and then they're evolving it into something unique. But it still has, the essential form of a Roman temple, and this is something we did not see in a early Christian basilica, and certainly not in a medieval or Gothic church. It's a little awkward in scale and proportions. It has this extra archway on top here that is, I'm not really sure what it's doing. So it's in a ways, I don't know that it's the most gracious building. But if you look at the facade rendering itself, or the front elevation, one of the things that you can begin to see more clearly is a affiliation with geometry, and an idea that Renaissance architects began to develop, and that would continue on, that good proportions and scale are found in geometry. And the Gothic builders, the medieval builders, they didn't really hold to that. One can certainly argue that the proportions of a Gothic church are quite gracious, very much more emphasis on verticality than what we would see in the Renaissance. But Renaissance architects really believed that the key to well-proportioned and well-scaled buildings was in geometry. And that sort of reflected an increased knowledge overall in mathematics and geometry that is also happening here in the Renaissance as well. And so here we see in red, this full square, the entire facade here, minus this weird looking thing on top, actually fits transcribed within the square. And then you start dividing it up, and you see where different elements come in. There are some circles that, if you transcribe, elements fall within these different components of geometry. And this is a good point to show you how that becomes an important element in planning and designs of buildings, and it becomes almost an obsession when we get to the Baroque era. And I'll show you some examples of that, specifically when we're talking about Baroque architecture. Well, when we see the interior, I think it becomes really clear that his inspiration here is Roman basilica. We have a very distinctive barrel vaulted nave with coffered ceilings. The side aisles are also barrel vaulted, turned perpendicular, so that helps to support the thrust, the sort of horizontal or outward thrust of the barrel vaults. By turning these in the opposite direction, these provide the buttressing necessary to support the main vault. So we don't need flying buttresses and all those kinds of things that the Gothic builders have come up with. And you can begin to see at the crossing is, the light coming from the dome above. And of course, on the far end, you see the rounded apse that was typical of early Christian churches and of a Roman basilica. And in fact, if we really look at perhaps what might have been the inspiration to Alberti, we can look at the Basilica of Constantine, dating from the early 300s. And this is, would have been a run like this in Alberti's time, but he would have seen either personally or through, the various books and publications that were starting to be developed, and things like Brunelleschi's work documenting Roman ruins. He would have been familiar with these vaults, with the coffers within them, and looking to, this sort of architecture as the inspiration. The last, or another example, moving away from Alberti, is we got to bring in Leonardo again. I've mentioned him a little bit, mostly as an artist and a inventor, but he did dabbled in architecture a little bit, nowhere near the other three Ninja Turtles. Santa Maria del Consolazione, this is in Todi from 1508. The two architects actually are Cola de Caprarola and Donato Bramante. Leonardo, but they based their design on a design scheme of Leonardo da Vinci. And I'll show you the actual building. It's just a small chapel. This is not a big church, kind of dramatically sits on a hillside. But it dates from 1508, but it's based on an actual design by Leonardo from 1490. He wasn't the actual architect. The client didn't approach Leonardo, but the Bramante and Caprarola definitely had seen these little designs by Leonardo and said, hey, that would make a great church, when the time comes around. And so these are the designs that he had sketched out that they must have seen. And you can see it's basically a cube with a dome on top, 4 smaller little towers on the sides, and then a Greek cross plan. You can see the plan right here towards the bottom, with sort of rounded, half-domed chapels that extend out the sides. And if we go back to the image of the church, we see almost exactly this design. We got a little cube base with these rounded sides to create the Greek cross, the half domes, and then a very classical Renaissance dome on top. Sits on a drum, slightly vertical dome, similar to what Brunelleschi had built at Florence, and then a small lantern on top. So not an exact copy of what Leonardo had done, but I got to throw in Leonardo because I'll got to talk about all the Ninja Turtles. So that leads us to talking more about Donato Bramante. One of the key figures still in the early Renaissance, and helps develop in several key projects. The first I want to talk about is Santa Maria presso San Sotiro. This is in Milan from the 1480s, finished in 1492. Here is Bramante, very talented architect. He emerged in the 1400s as one of the premier architects in the Italian peninsula of the time, and as we'll see, became very respected and sought after for his quality of his work, and culminating in a major project that we'll be discussing today. This project was a difficult one in that there was it was a very tight site on and didn't have a lot of depth to it. And so he wanted, like we saw at Alberti's church, he wanted, a long nave. He wanted a transept crossing, a dome in the center. You can see the dome at the crossing. But because of a building here off to the right, if you're looking at the plan where my pointer is, there was an existing building there. And so he didn't have the depth to really create a deep ambulatory, apse with chapels and with the altar. So he had to sort of design on the fly here, kind of a creative solution for that. And let me show you an image of what he did here. So this is standing in the nave, looking, you can see a bit of the base of the dome here. Here's the pendentives coming down to the piers that support the dome, and the altar, of course, directly in front of you. And we see a Roman barrel vaulted space with coffers. We see the classical pilasters, and at the far end is, some niches and, a beautiful altar piece in the back and so forth. So take a close look at this, and then take a look at this view. Notice anything a little strange? Anyone want to pipe up and say, wait a second, what's going on here?
He's using perspective to make it look like it's longer than it really is.
Yeah. Yeah, so here, I'll go back. So when you stand directly in front, it looks like a deep, recess, barrel vaulted and all that. But in fact, it's flat. He is using the perspective discovery that Brunelleschi had earlier in the century to essentially create a faux apse. And there is an actual altar right here. You can see the actual altar, but all of this, the back of the altar mantle, the barrel vault, the classical columns, all of that is on a flat surface. It's frescoed in by a very talented artisan, and it makes it look like it has the classical proportions and depth to it, even though it's painted on a flat surface. And so I like this to show this because it really ties in that early work and the importance of Brunelleschi, who remains one of the key figures for a long, long time for the different discoveries that he had come up with. So probably Bramante's most famous work is, and it happens to be my favorite name of a building, just because I love the way it rolls off the tongue in Italian, the Tempietto San Pietro Ementorio, also known as the Tempietto. This is in Rome from 1502, and it is a small chapel that is on the site that is regarded as the site of the crucifixion of St. Peter. And so there's an existing, I don't know if it's even a church. I think it might be like a monastery or something that's on the site, and they had a courtyard. And within this courtyard at the center is supposed to be where St. Peter had been crucified. And in early 1500s, they wanted to build a small chapel over the site to sort of honor that. And so in a way, as a commission, this is not a huge commission. It's not this massive church or big palazzo or something. It's very small and intimate. But he really devoted, because it's so important, right, to Catholics, to the church at the time, the site of where St. Peter was crucified. So it's an immensely important one, and he devoted all of his efforts and energies into getting just the perfect building. A lot of people really think this is one of the most perfect Renaissance design created. So this is the plan. You can see in the sort of gray is the existing building, and actually it's actually a squared courtyard. He was going to do a sort of rounded colonnade around it, as we'll see in a moment, but that didn't happen. So it's just sort of a plain squared off courtyard. But in darker in the circles here, this is the plan of the Tempietto. And all it is a tiny little space. I mean, there's nothing really happens in here. You can almost not call it a building. There's a small altar, and a priest or a monk or something could come in here and pray or say a devotional or something like that. But this is not, you're not going to have a crowd of people and have a big mass or something like that within it. So here's a view of it. You can see the courtyard is rather plain. It never got developed by Bramante. They did not follow his design here. But what we see of the chapel is this perfect little classical building. We have a Doric order. It's a round building, which it has its traditions in classical architecture and early Christian architecture even. And it has a simple little Renaissance dome on top. And to the next slide here, we can see a little more detail. The proportions are perfect. The proportions of the Doric columns. We have an entablature that is based on the Greek Doric entablature with triglyphs and metopes right in this area here, if you're remembering that. Then it has this classical balustrade on top. The entrances, there's pilasters on the inside. The entrances have classical entablatures over them and so forth. And it's really regarded as one of the most perfect little designs. There's a video, and I think it may last almost 6 minutes or something. So we'll take a pause here and go into the Blackboard under course materials and click the link to the video for the Tempietto, and that'll give you a little more information about it. And then we will rejoin here in a few minutes.